Hey there, folks. Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 liturgy fan, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Convulsing record, Perdurance. Now, before I talk about the record itself, I want to talk just a little bit about metal as a whole, so just bear with me here, alright? So, I don't think it would be the boldest statement, I don't think it would be the hottest take in the world to say that metal as a genre, as a form of creative and artistic expression, goes a little bit underappreciated and underestimated by the general public, and that especially rings true with some of the more inaccessible or extreme corners of metal. I'm talking black metal, death metal, progressive metal, and all of their respective avant-garde and otherwise out there counterparts, and I don't think it's really that hard to see why. I mean, when you take into account the fact that some of the only death metal or extreme metal albums that have stuck around or have been made aware of within the public consciousness are records like Tomb of the Mutilated by Cannibal Corpse or Altars of Madness by Morbid Angel, you kind of realize that these are decades-old albums, and while there's nothing wrong with those records, they are phenomenal classics that need to be heard for any real death metal fan. I also will say that they are albums made decades ago whose entire purpose, for the most part, was to be blasphemous, to shock, to disgust, etc., etc., and I think a lot of people either A, have the same reactions they did back then and feel very disgusted by it, or B, because we live in 2024 and can't be on the internet for more than an hour without seeing a cartel execution, just don't feel that shocked by it anymore. Considering that's most people's only exposure to heavy music in the way that death metal is, in the way that some black metal is, I feel like a lot of people take it as a joke, take it as a grotesque bit above all else, and even some classic death metal, extreme metal albums that are known for being a little more quote-unquote sophisticated, and I hate to use that term, like Symbolic by Death or Unquestionable Presence by Atheist, they mainly get discussed by either nerds or people really into metal as a whole, which, I mean, that's also nerds, but it's a different kind of nerd. My point is, there are a lot of people out there who unfortunately just don't see metal as something that's legitimate in terms of being able to create emotional or artistic depth, or really do much of anything with, if I'm being completely honest. And that brings me back around to the album I want to talk about today, this Convulsing record, Perdurance. This is Perdurance, the Brendan Sloan-led one-man project, Convulsing's latest studio album, their first since 2018's Grievous, and it is stunning. This record right here manages to strike a perfect balance between the right type of complex instrumentation you get out of prog metal, the absolutely devastating sounds you would get in the finest forms of extreme metal, and above all else, some of the most emotional and powerful lyrics that you will probably hear in metal all year. I know that it's only March as I'm recording and filming and uploading this, but I'm calling it now. This is probably going to be one of the peaks of metal lyricism for 2024. The entirety of Perdurance is performed by the aforementioned Brendan Sloan, coming out of Australia, and beyond his solo work as Convulsing here with this one-man project, Sloan has also made a bit of a name for himself within the realm of death metal via his membership of the band Altars, a group that I do highly recommend in their own right. However, I've always felt that Convulsing was the best way to see Sloan's talents fully on display, and that remains true for his latest effort. Even beyond the obvious inherent talent that it takes to know instruments well enough to record an entire album, especially a very dynamic album like this one, completely solo, providing every single bit of instrumentation with little to no creative input from outside sources, Brendan Sloan approaches every single instrument that he provides and brings to the table here like a grizzled veteran of each of them. And I don't think I need to really tell you that learning one instrument alone is extremely impressive, and mastering one instrument is beyond impressive. I've been playing bass for years, and I still suck ass at it. I can confirm it's difficult. But to learn how to play so many different instruments and then put them all together into a record that sounds like a cohesive band where every single corner of the record manages to stand out is beyond impressive, and it's the kind of stuff that very few artists throughout history in any genre of music can properly pull off. This is some serious Prince, but for avant-garde metal kind of stuff going on here. His guitar tones throughout Perdurance are, in particular, really stunning. The very sharp and metallic but never overly distorted tones that are being found here are walking this perfect tightrope between being clean enough to be obviously from within a studio with a mindful producer in the form of Sloan, while also being raw enough to not feel overpolished and to properly convey the atmosphere and emotion being poured into the guitar work here. Of course, that's not the only highlightable quality of the record or anything like that, but upon first listen, it was immediately the thing that jumped out to me, and several listens later, it's still something that I walk away being deeply moved by every time I finish the album. I mean, the fact that he can pull off these odd time signatures in some genuinely bizarrely structured compositions while managing to also create these excellent guitar-based build-ups throughout a lot of songs before unleashing fury at certain heavily noise and chaotic passages, and also still delivering some riffs at the same time that are distinct, that are memorable, that feel heavy and have a lot of weight behind them, but at the same time don't feel slapped in there for the sake of appealing to people that just want some face-melting riffs or solos. It manages to be this amalgamation of all of his different talents and skills behind the guitar, and as a whole, I think it works out amazingly. Similar things could be said about the bass work here as well, which never overpowers any other quality of the record, but never goes too far into the background either, never blends into its own surroundings too terribly much, and definitely does break the age-old stereotype that metal far too often has bass lines that are just completely muffled and inaudible. My point is, and justice for all, this record is not, and that's what matters to me. The blast beats that he delivers as a drummer throughout a number of different passages here prove Sloan's endurance as a percussionist, and the double kicks that he's putting behind Flayed during a good chunk of that track give it this very hefty, grinding almost kind of feel to it that I feel really makes that track in particular stand out as especially apocalyptic in an album that's already filled with some of the most devastating music of the year so far. All of this is to say that Convulsing is a project made up of a single man who is an extremely talented multi-instrumentalist with a unique set of skills and musical abilities that apply perfectly to Perdurance and make it one of the most musically captivating albums of the year so far. It kind of feels like Brendan Sloan always knows exactly what to do to elevate every single track here, from conceptually great to execution amazing. It kind of feels like he always knows exactly what to do. Everything feels so natural. None of it feels self-indulgent. Every note feels essential. This is a near perfect album in terms of performance. Even ignoring the actual instrumentals, the performance work here, Perdurance is a record that seeks to achieve some above-average degree of lyrical accomplishment, even beyond its technical abilities. And considering, like I said at the beginning of this review, metal is not always a genre really known for lyrical content, or at least forms of extreme metal aren't always known for lyrical content, I deeply admire the bold kind of direction that he's going in here by putting a heavy focus on the lyricism while also not really compromising any of the heaviness of the actual instrumentals. And look, it is very possible for any metal record trying to be emotional to come across as contrived, and that's mainly due to the fact that many different subgenres within metal already have very explosive sounds and styles, very massive natures about them. So there can be times where it feels maybe a little bit masturbatory for a band with an already massive sound to be trying to write massive lyrics to go alongside it. That being said, Perdurance as a record is anything but contrived. In fact, I don't think I've heard an album as deeply personal, emotional, and vulnerable as this record so far this year. There is a certain abstract quality in Brendan Sloan's style of songwriting that I personally find a great amount of enjoyment in. It feels cold and unmoving, yet at the same time never too terribly distant from the listener in terms of perspective, in terms of point of view, which is a very difficult thing to achieve, as it usually leans towards one or the other, and that goes for really any genre of music's songwriting when personal songwriting comes up, but I digress. I think that there are a number of moments here that feel like they almost come across as journal entries that are being shared with the listener openly, or something adjacent to that, and because of that, I feel a pretty deep connection with this album. For example, you have tracks like Inner Oceans, where Sloan is talking about feelings of drowning without warning, or how torrents of emotion swallow everything, and it really does feel like you're getting a peek into the guy's psyche, while some of it is still intentionally closed off to the listener to allow for individualistic interpretation as well as individual absorption of the, again, more abstract, idiosyncratic qualities of the lyrics themselves, and I absolutely adore how that is executed here. Directly after that track comes a 3.5 minute ambient piece that is executed more than tastefully. It has this sort of gloomy, foggy atmosphere about it that I think pairs with this record and a lot of its destructive qualities very well. It acts as a nice break too, so the album doesn't feel totally overwhelming or too monotonous, and it also manages to act as a nice bit of build-up too, which is great because it then transitions into the following track, Gossamer Paul, which in and of itself becomes a violent whirlwind by the end of it. It all manages to fit into place here and works perfectly. The track listing ordering here is pretty phenomenal, honestly, and that may be an odd thing to compliment if I'm being completely honest, but it really does just go to show how much love was poured into this record. I would say that the first as well as the last sign of warmth here throughout this record comes actually in the form of the very final line of the album closing track, Endurance, where Sloan states, "I'll endure a little while longer." And it's that exact moment that, upon first listen, it really clicked with me that I absolutely love this album. I say that because with that final line just continuing to endure a little while longer, the entire record is given a sense of purpose. Not to say that the record was bad before that line or anything like that. It was amazing instrumentally, conceptually, lyrically beforehand, but that final line after this sea of cold and isolating and often self-loathing at times lyrics, that one line that gives just a small glimmer of hope, it kind of feels like it ties up this record just perfectly. This entire album is an absolute journey through a variety of emotional turmoils that one is going through, and it feels like that final line is just that small sparkle that things will be different, that things will be better, and no matter how dull that light ends up being, to always just hang on a little while longer until it brightens. And I absolutely love, ultimately, the way that this album closes off. I think it's the absolute best way that it could have satisfactory, have ended. Convulsing is not the sort of project that you really go into expecting messages of hope and inner serenity, but through all of the misanthropic lyrics that you can find here, I really do think that Brendan Sloan's work here has kind of an ending that is just about as beautiful of a final note as you could possibly hope for. I'm going slightly off script here from my original review while still trying to semi-stick to it, but I really do want to kind of deviate from the script a little bit here, just to point out how powerful this album can honestly be, as well as how much this represents how powerful metal as a genre can generally be. I mean, I'm not going to lie and say I cried to this record or anything like that. I did not, though there's always the possibility in the future. But as a whole, I still have to say that this is a journey of an album. It's an emotional roller coaster. It's an album that seems to be so disassociated from the world, disassociated from the idea of one's self, but at the end comes back around to feeling some semblance of hope again. But at the same time, it's reasonable. The final line of this album is, "Oh wow, suddenly I feel a lot better." The final line of this album is talking about enduring for just a little while longer, being around just a little while longer. And you can absolutely take that in a variety of ways. If someone walked up to me and said, "Hey, I actually took that as enduring a little while longer because this person's normalizing the pain in their life and they're just gonna deal with it," then I could understand that perspective as well. But the way that I personally take it, and the fairly interpretation-ready lyrics that are being provided by Sloan here, I take it as this final moment where, despite all of the tragedy, all of the pain, all of the agony that the narrator throughout this record, assuming it's the same narrator throughout, has gone through, there's just a slight bit of hope left. And ultimately, because of that, I feel like this is one of the most interesting, one of the most lyrically and musically dynamic metal albums that I've heard in a while. And I promise I'm not just saying that because I heard the new Ministry recently and I have low standards for all metal all of a sudden. This just genuinely is an absolutely stunning piece of work, and far and away one of the most distinct metal albums I've heard in quite some time. Albums like Perdurance are why people who write off metal as nothing more than just shock rock adjacent stuff for people who want to headbang should be encouraged to go beyond the very often graphic surface level extreme metal bands to find stuff that's as obsession worthy as an album like this. This is truly phenomenal. And look, Brendan Sloan is no stranger to putting out some undeniably intense albums out under the Convulsing name. He has put out several great records in the past that I do recommend, but this album right here I recommend above all else, and not just everything else he's ever worked on, I just mean everything else I've heard this year so far. If you are looking for unique instrumentation that is unlike anything else you've heard this year so far, I say give this one a listen. If you are searching for a metal album that has some legitimate lyrical and even poetic depth to it, and you are struggling to find something that fits that bill that will interest you and keep you engaged with it, give this one a listen. My point is that Perdurance is set to easily be one of the standout metal albums of the entire year, and if you are even remotely interested in metal, even if you're that interested in metal, you are missing out if you don't give this one a go. I mean, it won't be for everybody, of course, especially since it does lean on the more avant-garde side of several forms of extreme metal, but at the same time, even if you aren't really into that thing, I say, hey, maybe push your own boundaries here and give this one a listen. It's up on Bandcamp. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.